Welcome once again, everybody, to the Academy of Urbanism's Congress Fringe, to our 3x3 series. I'm Rachel from the AoU. Fringe to our Congress 2021, which is taking place in June from 16th, 17th and 18th in Edinburgh. Before we start this evening, I'd really like to extend our thanks on behalf of the AoU to our 3x3 organising group, drawn from members, both academicians and young urbanists who've put a lot of work into pulling these events together. And also we'd like to extend a thank you to our series sponsors, to Collective Architecture, to Igloo and to Ibstock Brick. I'm pleased to hand over to our chair for the evening, Karen Anderson, architect and founder of Hirta. Karen.
Hi everybody, and welcome, and thanks very much for coming. I'm conscious that where I am, it's a beautiful sunny evening outside. So I know though that you'll be glad because we've got lots of great presentations this afternoon or this evening, and we'll be addressing the theme of every day in the city. We're hoping that once you've heard the presentations and been involved in the event, that you will be able yourself to come up with ideas and thoughts, because we're really keen that what comes out of this evening goes forward to the AoU's Congress in June, the theme being responsive cities. Cities have always responded over time. They have thrived, and their popularity has waxed and waned according to the economic and cultural changes they've faced. But they've always been places that manifest inequality in society. And for every city that has places that actually brings wonderful spaces for people coming together, through planning and investment decisions, we also create exclusive places, no-go areas, places that divide us. As we deal with the impacts of climate change and the accelerated changes in our lives, which the pandemic has highlighted, and the increasing inequality that's coming out of that, we as practitioners and as citizens and politicians have an opportunity through our practice to ensure our cities are more adaptable in the future, more accommodating and more resilient, more engaging, and more able to help us live our best everyday lives. So if we're to do that, we need to better understand what will make for more inclusive cities. And our three speakers in their work and practice have been doing just that. They're listening and capturing through their practice what people need, what they want, and what they don't want in the cities of the future. So we will have these presentations, but we also are asking these key questions. And I would really urge you to respond, because again, I think that will make for an interesting discussion at the end. So we're asking, where do you go to feel good in the city? What do you need from the city? What would be important in your best everyday city? And most importantly, how can we actually make that everyday city happen? So these are 4 bits of work, I'm afraid. But without any further ado, I'll just go on now to introduce our speakers. We have Jennifer Novotny, who's the project officer for the Diverse Heritage Programme at Scottish Civic Trust. We've got Mitch Miller, who's an artist, researcher, and the inventor or creator of Dilectograms. And we've got Selina Hales, who's the founder and chief exec of Refuweegee. So 3 fabulous speakers. I would just let you kick off and hear from Jen first. Thanks very much.
So thank you very much to AoU for the opportunity to speak to you today. I work for the Scottish Civic Trust on the Diverse Heritage Project, and as part of that, my role is to work with community groups, very small scale grassroots groups around Scotland, and this is really to try to attempt to diversify the experiences and the stories that are being recorded and shared as part of Scotland's cultural heritage. One facet of this work that I'm going to talk to you about today is looking at LGBT plus community and recording queer heritage, and we've done this primarily through community mapping. This started back in 2018. At the time, I was talking to colleagues at Scotland's Urban Past. This was a project that had been run with Historic Environment Scotland. subsequently finished. But at that time, we were throwing around these ideas. What could we do with queer heritage? What could we start to record so that this is going to be something able to be shared with posterity? We got in touch with LGBT Health and Wellbeing based in Edinburgh to try to come up with some ideas of if they would be interested in partnering up in this. And in November of 2018, we decided to hold a focus group session with their queer, trans, and intersex people of color group. So we came into that focus group meeting as sort of heritage sector professionals, trying to think of what we could maybe pitch as possible activities to see if anybody was interested in working on. And the idea we came up with was, what are the heritage spaces in the capital that the LGBT plus community felt were relevant or were sort of excited about or wanted to engage with? And we were sort of, in our minds, thinking, you know, you've got the tour buses that go all around Edinburgh. And we thought, well, what if there was a rainbow bus? Where would the rainbow bus go? What are, like, I don't know, the 6 best sites that the queer community would really like to engage with? So this was our sort of opening gambit. And sort of 5 minutes into it, it was clear that this was actually not helpful at all, because the word heritage was really problematic. In the heritage sector, it's really useful because we use it as a catch-all term to mean monuments and built environment and parks and spaces. But when we're speaking with this group, it was just sort of too big. So we started saying spaces, places, and stories, because I think the other stumbling block we hit with heritage is very much thinking of straightforward history and historical monuments and historical houses. And that's not really what we were trying to get at. We wanted a wider cultural heritage, stories and experiences that could be quite current and modern and personal. So we started asking, what are places that you identify with? Where do you like to go in the city? And one of the members of the group said that they didn't even know where to start with this question, and quote, "I don't know where to place myself." And this was really coming out of tension between an intersectional identity. So as a person of color, they seemed to have spaces where they socialized and had groups of friends. And this was often quite separate from their identity as a queer person. So we started thinking, well, what places could you be your whole self? And this led us to pull out a map. And this got conversation really started, and lots of enthusiastic conversation. So we thought, right, clearly this is what we need to be doing for our event. Let's get people around a map and explore this issue. So we decided to use community mapping. If you're not familiar with that, we're talking about a very parochial, local, subjective way of mapping your local area, including memories, experiences, how you actually move through a space. The idea of it being, quote, multivocal, dynamic, and inclusive. You could have lots of different interpretations. This is in contrast to something, if you would think of a very authoritative, top-down, official type of map. So for this, we decided that we were going to both record queer space, so that is space that the LGBT plus community already embraces and accepts and feels ownership of, as well as doing something more active, which is queering Edinburgh's spaces. So that is maybe looking at this from a very specific lens and trying to subvert interpretations of the city and sort of take over some of that space as well. I would suggest that this type of interaction is particularly useful with groups who haven't engaged with the heritage sector or history or the built environment, because you don't need to have lots of specialist jargon or terminology. It's not like you need to come knowing the context of an architect and the date a building was built and what it was used for. There are people that certainly bring this to the table for all of the sessions that we have, but you don't need any of that prior knowledge. You can come and just describe how you use your city and your memories and the things that you know about spaces and places. So our event is queering the map of our city was what we came up with. And I would say that in 2018, when we were talking about this earlier that year, there was a Queering the Map project that started in Montreal by Lucas La Rochelle. And at the time in November, I hadn't actually heard of that project at all. And it was when we were doing our homework and planning the event, which we had then held in February of 2019, that I came across that work. So I really encourage you to just Google queering the map, and it will bring up this map. This is purely digital. It started off in Montreal, but it now covers the world. It's anonymous, people pin things, and it's all moderated from Montreal. So querying the map of our city, we got together. It was a beautiful sunny day. We were in the City Arts Centre, right next to Waverley Station. You had views over the city. You could see the Scott Monument in the distance. So it was quite a nice space for us to inhabit. As I said, that we initially approached LGBT Health and Wellbeing, who helped us co-organize the event. Working with partners is extremely important for everything that I do. We also brought on very early into this planning Our Story Scotland. So if you're not familiar with Our Story, they started, it was around 2000, collecting oral histories of the queer community in Scotland, transcribing them. These are deposited with the National Library of Scotland, and if they receive any documents or artifacts, they have agreements with National Library of Scotland as well as National Museums of Scotland to be able to deposit these artifacts. It was really great working with them, and we've worked with them subsequently in the rest of the queer heritage activities that we've done. They set the tone for the event by reading excerpts of oral histories. So we started off with this narrative, and it was really important for me to let people know at this event that personal stories are very welcome. The type of heritage and history we're doing was very personal, and we wanted to know how people experienced the city in all of these different ways and individual ways. So we had about 35 people attend on the day, and we set up 3 different mapping stations. We provided pens and markers and collage materials and all sorts of ways to interact with the maps. And as prompts to get discussion started, what we asked was, where do you go to feel part of your community? Where do you feel safe? Where do you feel visible? And this led to lots of really interesting discussion. And this is the what came out of the day. This is the actual physical product of the mapping session. So you can see here, in addition to all of the writing, we've also got little flags. So we looked up and sort of provided as many different types of identity flag as we could possibly think of. So this included the traditional pride flag, the Philly pride flag, trans pride, all the way through to things like the autism, BSL users, wheelchair users, and we also provided little blank flags. And the thinking behind this was how, when we had started this with the queer, trans, intersex, people of color group, were these layers of identity. And how do we take those layers and actually physically represent that in an easy to use way on a map? And we thought with these flags, you could actually literally layer them with tape and glue and pins. So you can see an example of that in the corner of the picture. Somebody labeled our temporary pop-up space, queering the map, as this place where all of these identities were welcome and embraced. So that was really nice. So again, the stories that we got were everything from, historical firsts. This was the first club to open here. Here was where Lavender Menace opened. But then it got down to the really personal. And one example that I've highlighted here is, here's a Mexican eatery. Told my dad I wanted to be with women. He told me he already knew. So this is an address on a street that probably most of us would walk past and never think of, but for this person at least, this is a really important moment in time for them. This is a landmark. This is a monument in the city. After about an hour or so, we encouraged groups to swap to different tables, and they were able to edit. Nobody was allowed to remove anything that somebody else wrote, but you were allowed to comment and get into some dialogue and add notations. So example, a club, this club is great for lesbian women, but it's actually really horrible for trans women. So you were able to sort of feed back. So an example here where someone has said, no holding hands. And then somebody sort of queried that and saying, well, actually, does class come into this? Does that sort of influence your perceptions of safety or not? Other spaces, it was sort of the temporariness of feeling safe. So we've got somebody saying that there are lots of quote aggressively straight pubs and bars. So maybe on the evenings and weekends, it's not great. And another good example of this is there was an area that was marked as largely safe, except if there was football on. So the space changed quite drastically if it was, for only a few hours on a specific part of a weekend. So as well as the physical map, we also created a digital version. Art student Holly Summerson created this for us, collaging materials and taking what everybody said. And this is an Esri Story Map. So this is something online. This is something that you can still see. I've got a link at the end of my talk if you're interested. And again, trying to translate that concept of layers. There are layers to the map that you can turn on and off, and different tags that you can explore as a way to see, again, trying to get that multivocality and see all of this in a visual way. So it's not just about recording. That was where our starting point for this was, but actually it was the social interaction of the space that was provided, and it was the discussion, the small group discussion as well as the larger group discussion at the end that I think was really the most interesting. So again, a really personal way of looking at the city. There is an actual address that somebody was able to point to and say, that's where I first realized what homophobia was. Somebody else brought up a really interesting point. You experience a city differently if you move into the city, if you choose to move into a city rather than if you're just born there. And they said, when you move somewhere, you forge the life that you want. So maybe those experiences were slightly more positive for some people than people who had been born and bred in Edinburgh. And finally, it sort of got everybody thinking about, well, what spaces are also lacking? And it turned into aspirational, talking about, somebody brought up, where's the space where you can just be LGBT? Where is the free community space? So again, similar to this pop-up space we were providing, it was pointed out that a lot of the things on our map were actually commercial premises. There were transactions. You had to pay a cover charge, or you had to buy drinks, or it was a restaurant, which can be exclusive. And where are the spaces that the community can just come together and hang out? And it just is reinforcing all of these, the everydays that we are all experiencing a little bit differently. So somebody remarked, I learned a lot more about other people's experiences and about my own community, the ability to be more empathetic by hearing other viewpoints. Somebody else just highlighted, again, feeling part of a community, that it was the exercise of coming together. It wasn't the finished product that was important, but it was coming together back in the day when we could still do that, and hopefully we'll do that again soon. Another person commented that it was the first time since I'm here that I was surrounded by queer people. So not feeling like you're the only person in a room or on a street who has a specific identity was really important. If you recall, the focus group that we started with was the queer, trans, intersex people of color, and we actually didn't attract that many people of color to this this activity, which we were disappointed about. Somebody commented more people of color were needed at the event. A map without them replicates whiteness and power, which I 100% agree with. What we were trying to do is be inclusive, empowering, and transparent through community mapping, but actually we need to work harder at all of our events to reach out and get the most diverse group of people possible. I think out of 35 people, it was maybe only 4 people that identified as people of color attended. So we would like to continue to work harder to attract diverse audiences. Very briefly, we've done other events, and it's just worth mentioning that these events take on the local flavor of the groups that we are working with. So later that same month in 2019, in February, we had an event in Ayr. We set up in a cafe at the Unity Grill, and as you can perhaps tell from the photograph, the mapping was a completely different style of mapping from what we did in Edinburgh. It was much more sort of large scale. It was much less of a focus of the event. It was much more focused on coffee and tea and cakes and community groups having the chance to come together and just chat about what they're doing, what their history was, what their next projects were. And it was really nice. There was, for example, East Ayrshire Council. There was a teacher who was working with secondary school pupils to create an LGBT plus awareness video for the schools, and they were able to premiere their video and show it off to the other groups. There was someone else who was looking into the history of Ayrshire pubs and the queer community. So there were lots of different, again, it was much more of a social aspect to this. Another activity that we did was with Glasgow Disability Alliance, and this was a mapping session that was much more akin to the Edinburgh session, sort of with big A0 maps and lots of editing. But with that one, we were able to also have a virtual walking tour offered by Tommy from Out on Sundays, which is an LGBT plus walking group. And I have to say, thank goodness it was virtual, because Glasgow was doing its worst that day. The weather was really miserable, so we were all very happy to be inside for that one. And this was a particularly good intergenerational audience. There were people sharing memories of Glasgow from the 60s and 70s, along with people who are quite new to Glasgow. And it was actually a newly constituted group as well. It was something that Glasgow Disability Alliance hadn't really provided before. So it was really nice to offer an event for them. And some of the really good feedback that we got was from an attendee. This was off of Twitter, saying, despite only being over the West Coast for a year, it was surprising how many symbols I could add during the Queering the Map session. We met new people and could be a whole person, no ID truncation needed. Again, it's trying to think of these, be accommodating to all of these different identities. And also the experiences of this group and the type of things they were talking about were different from what the Edinburgh group was talking about. For example, memories of clubs that were really good, but actually were basement clubs and had really steep steps. And somebody remembered actually being carried up and down the steps by a bouncer, probably much to the horror of health and safety regulations, because they couldn't actually access it physically. So just to wrap up, when we think about all of our everydays in the city, the more I work with community groups, the more it brings home to me that actually it's the social aspect of the built environment that is really important. It is what happens in and around our spaces and places that really define us, not just individually, but as a society as a whole. And that practitioners, really, we have to work hard. The stories and memories that we record and share and hope to pass on to posterity should be as diverse as possible to reflect the reality of modern day Scotland. And it's not that these voices, that the people in the past weren't queer or weren't disabled. We just don't have that. We don't have the records. So we need to be better about collecting those voices now and understanding the true nature of our cities. So if you're interested about community mapping, Scotland's Urban Past did a short video on the Historic Environment Scotland YouTube channel. Also, you can see our Esri Story Map, the Queering the Map of Edinburgh, and Queering the Map in Canada as well, that original one. And I'm sure we can share these links with you either in the chat or after. Obviously, I'm here after for any questions, but if you would like to get in touch out with this, I have my email address at the bottom. I'm Jennifer and I work at the Scottish Civic Trust. So please don't hesitate, and thank you very much.
Thanks, Jen. That was great. Please put some questions in the chat for Jen. I'm sure you have some. Our next presentation is from Mitch Miller, who is the creator of Dilectogram. He's an artist and an illustrator, and we're looking forward to hear from you, Mitch.
Okay, thank you, Karen. Right, I understand that I've got about 20 minutes. Most of my presentations are about 50% bad jokes and 25% terrible puns. I'll have to cut those out. What we're left with, I don't really know. When I do my presentation, so I make these things called dialectograms, which is a word I made up to describe a type of illustration that I was starting to make about 11 years ago. It was a joke initially, it was a pun, but then it came to have meaning and came to have actually some kind of currency, perhaps. So I want to use the word today unashamedly, although I probably should be ashamed to, because it is not a real word at all. What I'm going to do, though, is hopefully give you a sense of what that means, what the practice is, and why it may be of use to the themes we're looking at today. Now, when I usually do a talk, so a dialectogram is, you can see one just behind me there, maybe about A0 size, big kind of stiff mount board piece of artwork made over many weeks and months. I scan these and we produce them as fold outs, and usually at a talk I'll fold them out and let people colour them in, put their key down on it, have a look at it, and kind of gather round. Unfortunately, we can't do that today, so I want to just use some PDFs to give you a quick idea of what they look like and what kind of things, places I look at. So I'm going to start with just by going through a few PDFs quite quickly to give you that sense of that. That's not an exhaustive list of the work that I've done. I've done about 20 to 21 over the last few years, but I'll give you a sense of the ones I'm talking about tonight and what's maybe interesting about them. So if I can get screen share to work, I'll just very quickly show you the last one that I did. Hopefully you're seeing here a PDF now of the Barrowland Ballroom, my most recent effort. So the Barrowland Ballroom, very famous music venue and former music hall in Glasgow's East End. I misspent almost all of my youth there when I could afford it. I wasn't getting chucked out. And this drawing here, it's a combination of a map. There's a lot of mapping elements. It's not an architectural drawing because I wouldn't want to go into a room which takes in and claim that. It would be dangerous. But it's a narrative piece as well. You can see here that the 3 floors of the Barrowland are represented in kind of ground plan. And then what you've got inside of that is a range of text, of comic strips, of small diagrams, almost all of it coming out from ethnographic observation, conversation and oral histories that I collected over a period of 2 years in the case of this one. So this is one of my more glamorous and sexy ones, I suppose, in terms of subject matter, but it does give you, I think, hopefully a good idea of what we're talking about. I want to stop the share again and go to another one. I'm going to be very brave with the technology today. So I'm going to go back a wee bit now and look at a couple of others that are very different to that. This one here, very different space to the Barrowland, if I can just get it up, which is Clydebank Library, a central library in Clydebank, a town outside of Glasgow. Carnegie built beautiful building with a terrible 70s interior, which I was part of a project to redesign and rethink that interior for what was going to be a new clientele coming in with new housing. So a very interesting project, very speculative in many ways, and very connected to a design process in this case. So there was a design team coming in, they were going to be architects involved in the interior refit, and my job was really to engage the people of Clydebank in various ways through making this drawing. And I spoke to about 250 people in total over the 2.5 years, and about 1,000 in different ways. So it was quite a big project, and yeah, quite a busy one as well. Going back again to a very different type of clientele and very different project, but actually in many ways quite similar. This one here shows you Pierce Hill Community Flat, if I can get it up there, in Edinburgh, which just goes to show that I do occasionally leave Glasgow and get to do that to foreign places. A wonderful place, Pierce Hill, a very kind of working class part of Edinburgh with quite a transient population in that kind of wee district. A lot of homeless tenants, but also quite a lot of asylum seekers and so forth. And this was a community health flat, which was a non-clinical environment that was provided by the NHS to just offer non-clinical help, to offer health advice, and to deal with the social causes of health problems rather than, just simply referring to doctors and so forth, which it also did. It was a fascinating place run by an absolute genius called Beth, who had worked there for 7 years. And in this piece, similarly to Clydebank Library, it was a much more engaged process. There were about 30 to 35 people who were, every day almost talking to me about their place, but they also what they called their pet illustrator, whereby I became part of their program of events. I put myself at their disposal, and yes, they did use that because they weren't daft. So I did everything from kids' sort of fun days to workshops to helping with some of their design issues and problems as well. And we use this also as a part of service design in this case, even though our funders were contemporary art and sense of collective gallery in Edinburgh, we were looking at how the place worked. Did it work for everybody? We found actually it was quite gendered towards women in this case. It was a very female space, and the men were mostly out in the allotment, which you could just see up there. So a lot of questions came from that, and it was a very kind of generative and exciting process actually of ongoing discussion about the place. I want to show you another one now. I know I'm rattling through these, and they are all on my website. It's not the best zoomable technology, but you can see most of these up there and get a sense of them in your own time. But I'm just showing you these because I know I'm going to be talking about them as I go along. So this next one should be, and I seem to have lost it in my own screen, so just give me a wee minute, please, is the Free Headington, which just is a bit of a mea culpa. This is one I didn't finish. It shows a student occupation in Glasgow during 2011 to 12. It didn't get finished for a lot of very complex reasons. Though, and like people to see it, is because I find it's actually quite useful. It shows my process. It shows how disorganized and messy that process is. Basically, like a fungus, the drawing grows over many weeks, and there's all sorts of stages of consultation and discussion around that drawing process. So you can sort of see here all my untidy bits, all my dirty laundry, and you can sort of see how the drawing kind of comes about. And this again was a drawing that was done very collaboratively, much more so than the earlier, which I will show you before I go into the PowerPointy bit. So yeah, so if I can just find here. So this was about 2011, and I'd already been making dialectograms for 2 or 3 years, and was really figuring out what they were. This is from my Red Road Flats series, a series I made in Red Road Flats, the famous high-rise housing scheme in Glasgow, no longer with us. My job was there to be there really as an undertaker of one of many of artists and filmmakers who were there to sort of mark the end of the scheme's life after 40 years of service. And this is one of my very early dialectograms where I got to know the concierges, learnt their routines, worked on their routine, on their kind of shifts with them, and got to understand it. And through showing just their very simple concierge station, through the objects, through the kind of practices in there, tried to show what life was like from their point of view, as it were. And then finally, and this is hopefully segueing into the actual meat of it now, two that are very, very closely connected. I'll just show you one of them, actually. This is the very first dialectogram that I did. It wasn't even a dialectogram then, hadn't had the beers and invented the word, you know, sometime around midnight at that point. And this shows a traveller's yard, a showman's yard in Glasgow. Glasgow has the largest concentration of travelling show people in Europe. It also, just outside at Lark Hall, has one of the largest concentration of gypsy travellers there. Glasgow is, as a industrial, post-industrial space, quite attractive to traveller cultures, especially GRT cultures, because of the spaces it has to put their very unique lifestyle and life needs in there, namely wagons, chalets, trailers, as in caravans, and their equipment that they take with them. And this shows one at Back Causeway, which I did way back, sort of almost as a cartoon of mapping and architectural drawing and planning kind of illustration to show that life, as it were. And I'll explain why in just a wee minute. So if I haven't already used up all my time, I'm just going to kind of go now to sort of show what all this means and why it might mean something of value to the discussion we're having here today. Okay, so yeah, dialectograms, as I say, it's a word I made up to describe my efforts to capture place in a number of different environments. Basically, the point is I've worked in a range of different places. As a freelance artist, you know, freelancer comes from an old word for mercenary. There's a truth in that, right? You go from job to job. And there's been a real range of experiences there, some really good and some quite dispiriting and disappointing, as you said. I've worked for heritage, you know, kind of agencies and people dealing in heritage, fine art and contemporary art, kind of collectives, and library services, and you know, as you know, arms of government almost, or local government. So it's been a very strange ride, I suppose, and the sort of practice then of going from client to client, collaboration to collaboration, has really shaped how the dialectogram has grown and the socially engaged process behind that. And it's really that I kind of want to talk about in my last few minutes, you know, last 10 minutes or so, about how that process came about and why. So yeah, dialectograms, they are drawn artifacts. The average one takes at least 6 to 8 months, but a good one, I find it a bit longer. They are slow, very slow in the process, and that's deliberate. What I'm trying to do in each of these cases is find the architectures that aren't physical, in a sense. I'm trying to find the social architecture, similar to what Jen has been looking at, the stuff that isn't, necessarily represented in brick and stone openly, but is around it and can be found around it if you ask the right people and engage in the right conversations. Narrative, in a sense, is what I'm always searching out. I always like this photograph of the new tile, the old tile demolition of tenements, because it kind of shows what I'm often looking for. You see this building being sliced, right down the middle, and you see these scraps of narrative still left clinging to the walls before it all goes. And that's kind of what I'm there for, whether it's being demolished or not. Sometimes I do come into spaces where, demolition is kind of scheduled, in which case bad news of. Another time I'm looking at spaces that hopefully will continue to have a life and continue to grow. So to kind of go where Ellis started, because I think it's quite important to understand that. Ghana is a very personal, what in illustration we call self-initiated project, as in no money behind it. No one paid me for it, right? And this was the Travellerology drawing of Back Causeway, the Travellers' Yard in East End of Glasgow that I showed you just there. Very personal because I live on that yard. My parents and brothers, sisters, various cousins, it gets very confusing after a while, all live on that place, and there are about 50 yards, as we call them, or grounds like that. Some ranging in some very small, like ours, about 10 families or so, to ones with hundreds of families living kind of cheek by jowl. Glasgow is, especially the East End, the showland capital, if you like, of Scotland. And these are just pictures of me as a baby, because I don't want to show any when I was a teenager. It got much worse after this. But yes, this is a life I grew up in. This is normal to me. This is what was an everyday for me. And we are talking about the everyday here. And it was a deeply personal project that was spurred by planning, actually. Planning for the Commonwealth Games, the plans to sweep aside quite a large chunk of these yards, about 25 initially, although it didn't end up that way, due to 2008, a way to build athletes' villages, Commonwealth Games complex, and to develop East End in ways that many would say was necessary. But we have been a feature of the East End for about 200 years, a very big part of it, but a very, very quiet, silent, hidden part. Because if you don't know where we are, you wouldn't see us. And you really have to know where to find us. We're all in old lots and bits of brown belt. The place where we live is an old foundry with these big brick walls that hides us from the rest of the community, which is traditionally been how people like it, both the locals and us, if I'm honest, like that. So my decision to try and show this world, in a sense, and try and show how a place like this works and how its everyday works, really came from that sense that we were going to be cleared out of Glasgow, a city we lived in for quite some time, with no real, as is typical in GRT situations like this, with no proposed alternative ready for us, as we get moved, as we get shifted. I was very aware that maybe it was time to start showing this and to, start conversations around these parts of this city, which is quite a sizable aspect of the East End. We're 10% of East End schools, for example, in terms of intake every year, but almost unspoken, almost secret. It's not now, but back then it certainly was. So I wanted to kind of offer that insight. I also wanted to counter, the sort of visual language that was coming out at the time of these bright, glossy spaces in Dalmarnock, and nothing wrong with that. If you know Dalmarnock before the Commonwealth Games, you can't get dew-eyed over it. But at the same time, you have to acknowledge there's not a lot of actual Dalmarnock that we may have known, or the East End that we might have known in these images. And also, so I was sort of countering this stuff with my own sort of cartoons, some of them quite emo and dramatic. You can see here a big fat giant landing on my home, actually. Here, I got a bit overbearing on it maybe, and a bit overworked up. But yeah, I was trying to sort of use my own practice in a way to comment on this and to engage in discussion and to encourage discussion and argument about this. And as you might have seen from the earlier quote, the work of Judith Oakley who worked with gypsy travellers in England for many years and did amazing work, also known for her work on Simone de Beauvoir, was hugely influential. This idea of, the way in which we live expresses a lot about the culture and vice versa. And if you understand that, and in this sort of plan diagram that she wrote in her text, you can actually start to understand a lot more about the culture and the issues around that, I suppose. So I filled notebooks with sketches of lots of different types of caravan, and there are many. And I also was very aware of how official sites for GRT communities, often gypsy travellers, for example, this being one in Edinburgh, were oppressive, grim. I'll just cut to the chase on this. They were quite oppressive, they were quite grim, they were very institutional, and they were very antithetical to the organic lifeways that actually are supposed to somehow fit into these spaces. So yeah, the beginning of Dilectograms was quite satirical. It was a wee bit adversarial, perhaps. I was sort of questioning things. I was deliberately taking the visual language of planners and architects and politicians, the diagram, the overhead view, the bird's eye view, and fucking with it. I'm sorry about the language, but that's what I was doing. I was playing with it. I was kind of deliberately messing with it. I was hijacking it in a sense, because the bird's eye view is very powerful. There's a lot you can do with it, actually. But it's also one that does distance. It abstracts us from what's going on in the ground. All through what I knew and just what I was playing with, really, as an artist, ways of messing around with that and confusing that and actually making the bird's eye view work in a more interesting way. You can, I think, take the bird's eye view, and depending on the bird that is inspiring you, do things with it. So I'm not going to go into my knowledge of avian kind of, fauna, right? But if you're thinking of swallows and, high-flying birds, they are going to be seeing an abstracted view. But pigeons, however, pigeons know exactly what's going on in the streets, right? They know where the old kebabs are on a Friday night. They know where people drop their chips. They know where it's kind of safe to perch. And they do that because they fly and they land and they flip between the ground and the sky. And it's a bit of a tortured metaphor. I also like tortured metaphors, by the way. I should have warned you at the beginning. But I find it really useful. The pigeon's eye view is this kind of more grounded way of using the bird's eye view that I've found very useful. And I took this forward into my work at Red Road, for example, which was a very documentary project in character. So I worked there for about 5 years on and off with a lot of communities, including the asylum seekers, although they were for various reasons, often legal. The work I did with the asylum seekers never made it into a final drawing. I drew a concierge station, an underground bingo, an underground bar, the flats in total, and a family home that people had lived in for 40 years. And that was really the documentary phase of the dialectogram, in a sense. It was quite straightforward documentary drawing and recording, kind of visual journalism, if you like, or graphic journalism, which I'm quite proud of in its own way, but did come away from at the end thinking, there's more I could be doing with this. There's more I could be doing with all this engagement that I get. Because I also have a background, having been a traveller activist and also a researcher on GRT cultures in my dim and distant past. I knew about it. I'd been trained as an ethnographer, had some training in oral history. So I was using these skills as well as my cartoonist skills. It's a very bizarre situation altogether, to kind of record and to capture. And I found what I was getting was quite powerful, but what wasn't there was a quid pro quo, if you like, or a back and forth. It was, I go in there, I grab the good stuff, I go and make my big drawing, and then I show it in the gallery, and everyone has a glass of beer. Nothing particularly wrong with that, but I felt that rapport deserved more, and it deserved more investigation, actually, than I was able to give in those early years. The ethnographer Tim Ingold talks, anthropologist, he hates ethnographers, talks a lot about ethnography and its practice of going into culture and community and extracting stuff, creating a knowledge object that then gets consumed by other academics and other classes of people. And I was very aware and very concerned that maybe in my own way I was doing something very similar with these big mad drawings. Now, there's lots of ways I've tried to sort of offset that, which I'll maybe talk about. But one thing I was very aware of is that as a person who did draw, drawing is not a sociable activity usually, okay? It's quite closeted. When you're in your space and you're drawing something, you're kind of in your head quite a bit. This is me in the studio, my old studio. Rest assured, the new one I'm in now is just as messy. Kind of making a dialectogram. I'm in my head. I've processed, months of material, and it's starting to come out of me in a sense, hopefully into something half decent. But that is not a transparent process. It's not a process that invites, or where it's easy to engage with people, I would say. And the fact that the drawings are like this big, complex, intricate mess also makes it harder, for example, to check the ethical kind of ramifications of certain inclusions, or make sure everyone's very aware of what's happening in the drawing and why. So I sort of took a bit of a time to reflect, if you like, and thought, okay, what am I doing here? How can I do it better? I started to tease out what my process might be, and this mess of lines here is kind of my process, all right? Proper designers, like product designers, have lovely flowcharts. I don't. I have a tangle of lines and mess because that is how they are done. And I started to think, well, how can the drawing be transparent? How can I use the drawing more effectively through the life of a project to bring people in and to allow them to be part of the process, which is still my process, admittedly, but is at least one where we can maybe get some engagement out of that goes beyond just recording problems and actually maybe creates conversations that are also useful. And the Pierce Hill drawing that I showed you was one of those cases where, through our collaboration, and it was a genuine collaboration at the Pierce Hill Community Flat, we came up with a lot of lessons for the place, lessons for me as well, and a lot of opportunities and options for thinking about how the place could be redesigned going into the future, or rather tweaked and improved. It was quite a gendered place. I was often referred to as one of the girls, which was lovely, but it did tell you something as well about the fact that the men of the community didn't come in the way that the women did. So Beth was left, thanks to me, but mostly thanks to her and her involvement in it, with a lot of things to look at. And we wrote a report. Beth took that forward, and she did various things to change that place and that space. But that was through that deep dive and that use of the dialectogram. And I won't go into thing theory too much tonight because we're all having a good time, hopefully. And Bruno Latour tends to put a damper on that. But the idea of the dialectogram as this object that I could sort of take with me in my ridiculously big portfolio, go back and forth with communities, show them at different stages of its development. So I'll show a dialectogram at 25% complete, then 50, then 75. And at each of those times, you have an argument, usually, about what's in the drawing. Very similar, again, to what Jen is doing with, those kind of consultations and mixing up a bit. And I embedded that into my practice as a central part of it, which made the projects longer and more difficult to complete, but also better, I think, and also of higher quality. So that when I went to places like Clydebank Library, where what the library needed was the knowledge of the people in the community, as well as their opinion and feeling. And we often miss knowledge, I think, as it's possessed by communities. Episode 2. So where we got to was hopefully a sense of the fact that dialectograms are not just big drawings, which they definitely are, but they're also a process. And the process has become as important as the drawings over time. And in fact, in many respects, when we look at outputs at the beginning of a project, often those what you might call softer outputs are as important as we go through what an engagement could involve. The projects vary. There's a lot of diversity in, and believe it or not, in what I do, but one thing's always the same. We always make sure the drawing is going to stay in the community as much as possible. So that's either in a free to view institutional space like a library or local museum, or it's in the place itself. And that's one thing that I've always been very definite about, that the drawing is an art object, and it has all of those things around it, but it does stay with the community. The knowledge object, if you like, doesn't get taken away, is really important. And if they want to then sell it to get a new roof for the church hall, or all go on holiday, they can do that, but that's fine by me. The kind of artwork stays there. But in terms of what I now do and how the practice is sort of involved, I'd just like to take a couple of minutes just to talk a wee bit about that. This is some pictures of Easter House here, an ongoing rambling project where I think the soft outputs became really important, if you like, and is still ongoing. We were going to finish it just before lockdown, and then, well, all of that happened. But Easter House in East End of Glasgow, northeast of Glasgow, massive housing scheme with a terrible reputation, but some of the nicest people I've ever met. Is a place where I've been working with a number of grassroots organisations. So that idea of the pet artist, the pet illustrator, I've made myself available to local housing organisations, Thriving Places, which is a group that does all sorts of work, local food bank and various others. And I found myself pairing up with them as a sort of, what can you say, a bit of fluff that helps make their job a bit easier. One thing we realised was that in East House, for example, there's lots of public spaces and kind of public events where some idiot with a pencil and some paper can create an event and create a performance that invites people in and creates the conditions for engagement. Because I think with engagement, you have quite a lot of stages. You have the initial meetings, the initial, establishing of links, but then you've got lots of other things that need to be done to get to what I think are good quality sort of involvements. And some of this is quite performative, actually. These are some pictures from my stint at the two Christmas fairs in Easter House, where I had a table, a pencil, and I offered 3 portraits if you would talk to me and a community worker who was there. And often these were health workers and outreach workers who wanted to contact members of the community. So they got that chance to actually make referrals and to identify people who might need help. I did them a nice portrait, which they could stick wherever they wanted to or wrap their chips in, whatever. And I also got contacts and leads for the dialectogram side of things. So through that sort of 3-way thing, we identified a lot of research subjects that we could then go deeper with, whether it was through service delivery, in the case of my partner, or through me kind of going and collecting some oral histories from them. And it got a bit out of hand, this whole thing, by the way. A lot of people came back the second day or third day wanting more pictures, some for granny, some for their pals. And, it was great. They gamed the system and I lost a lot of sleep. So that has sort of become the practice. The practice is very embroiled, it's very messy, and very involved, and isn't just about the drawing. The drawing's almost, it's not an afterthought, but it's at the middle of the process rather than the end. What has been interesting, though, is that other people have done dialectograms, which I never intended and never expected. But there are people in Portugal, for example, Gil Moreira and Carlos Mota, using it in actual planning, consultations over there.
So, hello everybody, I'm Selina, founder and director of Refuweegee. Well, another made-up word, so I feel in very good company because I love a made-up word and I think we should be proud of them. And I think that most people should hopefully know, well, certainly those from Edinburgh will know what a Ouija is. For anybody that doesn't, it's a sort of, used to be an offensive term, but we reclaimed it, like we do over here, as just a term for a Glaswegian person. So Refuweegee is an organisation that work with forcibly displaced refugees from all over the world who now find themselves in Glasgow and in Scotland. I like to call what is now a full-blown charity, but what was previously just a wee idea I had. I like to call it a very happy accident, but I had the idea back in December 2015 of providing people with community-built welcome packs. And what I'd wanted to do was make sure that when people arrived in Glasgow, they felt embraced and they felt part of the community. But I knew I couldn't do that alone. So I started to ask people to give me things, and very swiftly we grew into an organisation providing packs of essentials, of Scottish items, and most importantly of messages just like this one. Messages of kindness and of welcome from the existing community. We average, pre-COVID, we averaged around 120 welcome packs each month. We used to think we were really busy then. At the moment, we are averaging over 100 emergency support packs a week, because our model has had to shift to respond to the current pandemic situation. And like most third sector organisations who work with the most vulnerable in our communities, they have been hit the hardest by what has been happening over the past year or so. But today, what I want to speak about is not specifically the welcome pack element of our project, but it's to talk about the refugee experience of Glasgow. We set up a project in 2016 with a group of students from Edinburgh University that was called Claiming Back the Narrative. And that project was about giving the platform back to the refugee voice, which now feels incredibly ironic as the middle-class white woman talking to you about all of those experiences, but I will come on to explaining why that happens as well. Mitch sort of touched on that as well when he was talking about the many legal reasons why mapping out the red road flats and some of the detail of those asylum experiences would be problematic for the individuals involved. So I'm going to take you through some of the pictures that were taken as part of that Claiming Back the Narrative project, and hopefully share with you a different perspective of the city, what we call a view of Glasgow through refugee eyes. So the project begins with us getting a group of people together and giving them a disposable camera, which is always joyous because disposable cameras are just the strangest thing to use now that we all have full-blown computers in our back pockets and sort of phenomenally powerful cameras. So we take it back to basics, mainly for equality, and people get a disposable wind-on camera, and we spend a good few hours explaining to people you don't need to take the cardboard off, and yep, that little button on the front is actually the flash, and it probably won't do jack in the dark, so just take photos on sunny days because that's the perspective of Glasgow we like too. But they also get given a notebook, so peppered amongst some of these views of the city are some of the words that people arriving here have attached to their photos. So this building, the City of Glasgow College building, comes up in so many pictures. Our photographers are given no brief. They are asked to share their perspective entirely. There is no right and wrong. We just want to understand what it is like living in Glasgow through their eyes. So there's no direction from us. And that is obviously so that we can then raise awareness of the true reality and the true lived experiences of people who now call Glasgow home. So the college building features in every sort of group that we run. There's always somebody who manages to capture that "People Make Glasgow" slogan. And it's quite meaningful for me, and it's quite poignant because when I was setting up Refuweegee, my old office used to look out onto this building, and it was actually one of the instigators in getting me to think, do people make Glasgow if you are not from here? Is that quite an insular statement? Is it something that we sort of pat ourselves on the back about? Or is it actually the real experience of people who arrive in the city without it being their choice, or without it being, their chosen home? The lovely thing that always comes through, I'm just going to click on, there's always a slight delay with my slides, and I'm now going to jump backwards and forwards. Sorry, I appear to have frozen. There we go. There's what always comes through in the photos and in people's words is that people do make Glasgow for those who've recently arrived as well, and that's incredibly positive. The majority of the time, there are obviously examples where it doesn't, but people feel welcome here, and we talk about part of that being the welcome that we can provide as an organisation, but also that individuals within the city provide through sharing experiences, through storytelling. We love telling a story in Glasgow. As I said, the letters that go into the packs very often shape that individual's experience of Glasgow. We provide people with those welcome packs when they, normally within a couple of days of arrival, they go out through organisations like Scottish Refugee Council, Red Cross, Migrant Help, Glasgow City Council, So they're very often in people's homes when they first arrive. So it's quite interesting to see sometimes that the letter that that person receives can actually map their photographs and their journey with their camera, because the letters 9 times out of 10 apologise for the weather. Although not today, I'm just sort of bragging about it by sitting in the sunshine. But they apologise about the weather, and they suggest places that people should visit. And they sort of open up those spaces. Hopefully you can read parts of that letter there, but I think it's the end of it that just, it reads, "Please know that you are loved, and love crosses all borders and divides. It is universal." But whilst we see that perspective come through in people's experience of the cities, we also see a lot of, there's very little examples of home. There's very little examples of that individual's space that they call their home. It's a very focused experience of sightseeing and escapism, I suppose, rather than somebody capturing their day-to-day. And that's incredibly intentional for people, because outdoors is often a far nicer space to be, given the housing that we deem appropriate for people who've recently arrived in the city. And especially during COVID, that has shifted massively to include detaining people in hotel spaces. And we're not talking luxury hotels here, we're talking about real basic budget hotels, and the removal of people's freedoms, threats of being reported to the Home Office if you leave the hotel out with certain hours. Now, all entirely in breach of Human Rights Convention and all entirely unacceptable, but it happens day after day. And I think what comes across in people's photos is that opportunity to escape that part of their life and to explore a new city. So we always see pictures like this is from Necropolis, that we all know is a beautiful sort of space in our city, but we very rarely actually sort of go and sightsee ourselves. But whilst there's that sightseeing element, the other thing that comes across, and that I just think this picture captures beautifully, is that even pre-coronavirus and pre-COVID, Demetra's words here, "Be distant for your safety," don't just speak of pandemic social distancing. What they are capturing in that is something far, far more meaningful, and something far closer to her experience of the city, that you can get to a certain level of closeness, but you're still not home. You're still not completely encapsulated, I suppose, by the city. George Square always features incredibly heavily. Again, it's a social space. It's a place where people can come together. It's a place where there's lots and lots of pigeons. Mitch would like it. I can't stand it. I hate pigeons. I'm really sorry. I really don't like them. But people love that space and that opportunity to just be part of the city, to escape again. And I love the blending of sort of old and new buildings, the sort of ugly 70s sort of, brutalist buildings against the city chambers. But there are always people sharing about how that is a space that they can meet other people, that they can come together to feel part of the city, even when they know nobody within it. So it features a lot. Birds as well are always a sign of sort of freedom and flight, and the ability to travel and to move, which is such a huge part of everybody who participates in these projects' lives. Again, this picture is just sort of capturing the old part of Glasgow, and the participant is learning Gaelic, so has included the Gaelic for stones, which is clachan. And we often say to people in Glasgow, look up, because the buildings and the architecture is just so beautiful, but there is something really personal about this picture being looking down, and the conversations that we had about it were that until the city and until you are accepted by the city, which is generally when you have a successful asylum application, which is incredibly rare nowadays, you don't look up, your head is down. So this is the view of the city that so many people see. It's one of my favourite pictures that one of our participants, Mohammed Reza, took. And he speaks very, very little English, and he shared his experience of approaching this man to say, may I take your picture? And then in his broken English, it sat and spoke to this guy for ages. And I just think it speaks volumes to the shared experience of feeling like you don't belong in a city as well. And especially with the sort of GOMA, that's the Gallery of Modern Art in the background, and then the new office buildings going up. There's just something so well captured in it, because it all feels very distant for people who have just arrived, and I'm pretty sure for the gentleman there holding his Greg's cup. But Mohammed Reza spoke a lot at the point of sharing this picture about wanting to give back, that it's just because he has so little. He spent 9 months in a hotel when he first arrived in Glasgow. He arrived right at the beginning of lockdown, so there's no community groups, there's no ESOL classes, he had no mobile phone, he had no access to technology to communicate properly, therefore experienced technology poverty as well, and information poverty. So didn't really have a full understanding of what was happening and how he could connect with the organisations that have been able to keep going during this for a very, very long time. A very isolating experience for people. But words like this, I think, are exactly what that previous picture captures, that in this city, as long as you go out, as long as you are welcomed into it, and as long as you have the capacity to go and look for it, you will be given the opportunities that you desire as well, and that you will find them. And I think that's what comes across in a lot of the pictures that we're sharing and that we see people share, but it's also on the back of the understanding that city shows them. Again, another letter that I just think fits nicely in with that welcome, but there is an opportunity for us to pass on an idea of that feeling of understanding, which can completely change somebody's perspective of the city on arrival. So this letter just perfectly sort of captures it nicely, and talking about having to leave your homeland behind must be very difficult, and I can't imagine what you have been through to get this far, but wherever you go in the world there will always be nice people. I hope you find the nice people in Glasgow. And it's one of the ones I like because it doesn't say that we're all nice people in Glasgow, because we're not, and there is no city that can claim it is only filled with nice people. It's not naive enough, it's just very hopeful in that you will find them, and I hope you do. The pictures, there's a lot of focus on water in the pictures as well, a lot of photos down along the Clyde side, but you'll see over the next 3 pictures this sort of common theme of there being a barrier between these sort of boundaries, these physical barriers and borders between Glasgow and that person's actual experience. That it's important for people to get across in their pictures that they feel welcomed and they feel safe majoritively in the city, but that doesn't mean that it is entirely open to that individual. And I think these pictures capture that very, very well, that there is still an exclusivity to this space, that their experiences of the city is very, very focused on exploration over actual experiences, you know. So we're talking about going and viewing things that so much is outdoors, so much of people's photographs capture museums and free spaces and parks. They don't capture engagement, and I think that really gets across that the city is still quite an exclusive space for various people, and especially when you're living on asylum support, which at the moment is £5.73, I think it is, a week, that an individual is expected to live on whilst awaiting a decision on their claim. So £5.73 is to cover all your travel, all your clothing, all your food, your communications, so if you need to put money on your mobile phone. And our government came to that figure by doing a poll of the spending of the poorest people across the UK and stripping that back as much as they could, and they came to £5.73 for that. So I think it works out about 37 £37. Sorry, I've said £5.73 a week, I mean a day. So it's £37 a week and about £5.70 a day, which I don't know about in other places, but in Glasgow it's £5 now for an all-day bus ticket. So you're doing an awful lot of walking and not a lot of much else on that budget. And I think that's what these images get across, is that exclusivity of the space. However, and I'm incomplete obvious, as I'm sure everybody agrees with me, whilst it isn't a reason to continue to oppress people, the resilience of the refugee community is absolutely second to none, and unfortunately experiences of hardship often only make a person more determined, and that is what we see in people's exploration of the city, but also of their experience. I love this picture just because it really does look incredibly old, but it was actually only taken last year. This is from one of the participants last year. Nature features an awful lot, and we're incredibly lucky in our dear green place to have so many green spaces and so many parks and so many spaces that people can step outside of their accommodation and their stresses of the asylum experience. It's one of the things that letters very, very often mention as well, is the name Glasgow means dear green place, and I hope that is how you come to think of it. I do. I'm sending you some mustard seeds and mustard and cress seeds. You don't need to grow them in earth, just on wet kitchen paper. It's always good to have something growing in the house, and even better if you can eat it once it has grown. Just the thought that goes into some of the letters of welcome, I like to think really shapes somebody's experience of the city, and just knowing that that there are all of these park spaces to explore that people can step outside into. And this person goes on the back to explain the shops that you can buy these seeds in. But even in the images of nature and of outdoors and of our dear green places, there is still the capacity to capture the loneliness, the sadness, the complete isolation of it all. And yeah, it's that powerful experience that, yes, our parks are wonderful spaces most of the time, until it's a sunny day and then everybody's out in them. But they're wonderful spaces, but if you know nobody, if you speak no English, if you are using them to escape accommodation that you don't want to go back to, they're still not the joyous spaces that we probably think of them as. this was Awa, one of the participants from last year, just capturing this beautiful autumn that we had last year. Was just phenomenal. Someone had explained that it was a completely different year to normal because I can't even remember why, whether it was the temperatures going up and down so much, but it meant we got even better colours than we usually do. But yeah, nature is a big part of people's experience of the city, and I think that's the benefit of us being in this green space. And during COVID, we've all been forced outside in very different ways. So our outdoor spaces have been so much busier, but actually that's where our asylum community and where our refugee community have always been. That's because of the exclusivity of our indoor spaces. It's always been the social space of that community. The other theme that comes through with alongside nature is the theme for education. This is the University of Glasgow, and there is always a focus on educational institutions in the photographs. It's probably the most common theme across all of the pictures. This isn't to do with education, it's just been peppered in amongst the wrong place. This is a roundabout at Pollock in Glasgow, where there is a roundhouse on that roundabout that somebody used to live in at one time, I believe. But the reason that included this is that this is actually very near to where I live, and we drive past this all the time, and I know nothing of the history of this building. And it takes a different perspective a lot of the time for you to actually see what is right in front of you. And Awa, the participant that took this photo, she did loads of research into why is there a house in the middle of a roundabout, and was it always on a roundabout? And it was a museum for a period of time as well, and what existed there. So it becomes a sort of historical focus for people as well, the project. Looking up is something that we always tell people as well. The architecture and the buildings in Glasgow, especially in the sunshine on days like that, is so beautiful, and there's a lot of focus on those outdoor spaces, and again a lot of insight into areas of the city that we just walk past every day and don't see and take for granted. As I said about it, university, it becomes incredibly important for people, and the opportunity to study and to better and to then give back. The main reason that university is the focus and is so important to people is because a lot of the time their skills and qualifications aren't recognised here, even though they have huge amounts of skills and qualifications. They're not recognised, so people have to a lot of the time start again. So it's incredibly important for people to get into a university space as soon as they can. I think in terms of the refugee experience of the city, what is captured and what we see in everyday life in the city is what the gift of inclusion actually does. What does that give people, and how does welcome change somebody's view of the city, and how much power is in that? And that's almost what we're trying to focus on and to capture in this. And I think this letter does it very well. It was received by somebody who participated in the project, but who also received a welcome pack from us. And it's a beautiful letter to receive, and it's lovely to know that you have made a difference to somebody, that you've changed their experience of a space. However, what is just heartbreaking about it is that this is surprising, that the gift of inclusion, that the gift of being given your platform, being given space to exist within the community, still comes as a surprise to people. And that's something that we will continually strive to change, because it should be a norm. People should not feel grateful for being included. People should not feel that level of gratitude for being welcomed. They are simple acts and they should be the norm. This is Yaman, who's one of our board members now, and I think one of the first Syrians that I met in Glasgow. And he participated in the first photography project, and a few years ago, back when you could still have events and do things with people indoors, his photographs and lots of other people's were exhibited in the Kelvin Grove Art Gallery and Museum, and just giving that space to people who would not normally be represented in such a prestigious building as the Kelvin Grove. And we're trying to do some work with the Kelvin Grove at the moment, with Glasgow museums, around the lack of inclusion of refugee experiences, given the history in Glasgow and the volume of refugee contribution. Why is it lacking so much in our museum spaces, and what can we do to change that? And I think this is where I end. Yeah, with a quote from one of the participants of the project, and I think the perfect surmise as to what a photograph can do and why we need to listen to everyone's perspectives of our city spaces and of our shared spaces. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Selina. Lots to think about. I think we've had some amazing reflections on what the city is for different communities, different people, and in your case, people who, you know, have been through so much, and it's really important that we think about how the city can accommodate them and welcome them much more than it does. A lot of it is about the social issues and, you know, the people issues, but the city in its fabric, and it's the importance of its outside spaces and places that people can come together. We've got the AHA slides up as well. Please do use the QR code to access them, or go onto the web, because we will actually collect people's thinking about the city, because I think what we're really keen, we've had such fantastic reflections on how we can get closer to what people want in the city through their stories and through their needs, and through the amazing mapping work of Jen and the photos from Refuweegee. Sorry, I'm going to have this. I knew I was going to have this problem. Even being a Ouija, I get the problem when I put Refu on the front. But also the work that Mitch has done. I hope that everyone feels that they've gone away from the session with another perspective on how the city can develop in the future, because again, it's the diverse and inclusive city that's going to be much more robust in the future. And I certainly was uplifted as well as provoked by some of the things I heard in relation to what's happening with refugees in our country. But I hope everyone agrees that despite the rush at the end, we've learned a lot today. Please, if there's any follow up in terms of the questions, get in touch with Jen. That'd be great. So thank you very much. The next session for the Fringe events is going to be in a week's time, 28th of April, Play in the City, and the speakers will be Gavin Thompson, Anne-Marie Galmstrupt, Dinah Bornat and Fergus Anderson, and I'm sure it'll be an equally stimulating evening. Thanks for attending.
Thank you very much, Karen, for chairing that very ably and coping with the Zoom technical hitches. We've had a few of them. And thank you very much to our speakers, to Jen, to Selina and Mitch. And if you've enjoyed the session tonight, we'd really encourage you to visit the Academy of Urbanism's website and think about joining. And yeah, just to close with a final thank you to everybody, and thank you all for attending, and hope to see you next week.